Hi, welcome to We Act Radio in Anacostia, DC, live on YouTube and 1480 AM. My name is Melissa Byrne. I'm one of the senior advisors over here at We Act Radio, and we're excited today to be doing a special report on after legalization with John Walker. Hi, John.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So, John, why do you care about drugs?
So I really got into the issue starting in 2010. That's when Prop 19 was on the ballot in California. And I was really disappointed, being a progressive, that there was very little support for it amongst progressives or Democrats in general. And, you know, I was also really disappointed with the media because most of the headlines about it were, you know, some Cheech and Chong inspired thing. But, like, this is a very serious issue. There's 800,000 arrests every year around marijuana. The drug war has given the United States the highest prison population in the world. You know, we waste easily, you know, over $10 billion a year on, you know, enforcing marijuana and in lost marijuana tax revenue. And the impact has been directly put on minority communities especially. You know, there's a study by the ACLU that found even though white people tend to smoke marijuana a bit more than African Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana.
Right. So you wrote a book?
Yes, I wrote a book called
Sorry.
it's called After Legalization, and it looks at the future of marijuana policy after it, you know, starts to become legalized.
And where can we buy it? Is it published yet?
So we're doing a Kickstarter to fund it right now. If you go to Kickstarter and you look for After Legalization or John Walker, you can find it there. And hopefully we'll have the book out at the beginning of next year, January, which is when the first retail shops will open in Colorado, which recently legalized marijuana in the 2012 election.
So you touched a little bit on racial disparities in drug arrest. So we're here in Anacostia, and I have a feeling, actually I know the data, that someone in Anacostia who doesn't look like me or you, if they're caught with a dime bag of weed on them versus a Georgetown student, they're treated differently in the eyes of the court.
Yeah, so the sort of racial disparity runs through the entire system. One, they're not looking for dime bags in Georgetown. You know, if you, like, New York City is the extreme example where they do stop and frisk. They only do stop and frisk in, you know, African-American, you know, communities. The only thing they almost ever find is marijuana. So, one, they're not searching for marijuana in Georgetown, but then if you're arrested, you know, you tend to get a better plea deal, you tend to get a better sentence, you know, basically every single step of the process is more favorable to whites or anyone who have a lot of money to hire a good lawyer. You know, if you don't have a lawyer, you know, court-appointed lawyers at this point are practically a joke in how little they can provide.
Right. I heard recently that cocaine has been decriminalized for white congressmen.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a congressman recently got busted with, it was like an 8-ball of cocaine, like a lot.
It was a lot.
It was a lot of cocaine.
He was a frequent buyer.
Yeah, and like he was caught and like, you know, did they like raid his house like they would like, you know, someone in a minority community? No, they like told him. Like,
no SWAT team?
Yeah, they went to his house. They politely asked. He confessed. He gave him even more cocaine, which is like, there's a lot of cocaine the guy had in his possession. And like, all he got was like a fine like that was like equal to the amount that the cocaine cost. It was only like $250. And like, you know, it was a year or 2 probation.
He still has his job, right?
Yeah, like he hasn't actually, I don't know if he's officially stepped down. He's like on leave now, but let's just say your average person, you know, especially your average African American who got in that situation would not be treated so kindly.
What you're doing with your book with After Legalization is being able to show what happens when we finally get to the point where drugs are legalized. But before we get to that, I want to step back a little bit. We had an interesting conversation before we came on air where you kind of trace the history to me that I found really fascinating. I think will really connect to a lot of the audience in terms of how the prohibition of drugs has been used to target marginalized communities.
Yeah, so if you look back in like the record, all drug prohibitions have always been directed at minority communities. You know, alcohol prohibition was very much about keeping undesirables like Irish, you know, Italians who were, you know, seen as ruining communities by drinking too much. You know, opium was about keeping out like Chinese labor. Even marijuana, you know, we call it marijuana now, even though back in the day you usually referred to it as hemp or Indian hemp or maybe cannabis, because that was the Mexican word for it. So they wanted to make it scary and Mexican sounding because it's about like keeping out Mexicans or arresting Mexicans. And you can track this through with basically every drug. You go back to the old, legislation at the state or the federal level. There's almost always some overt or not so overt racial overtones. This is about stopping, these dangerous minority groups.
So that ties into a lot of the militarization we're seeing, militarization on the border that we're seeing.
Yeah, this sort of whole, there's a great book, The New Jim Crow. It really talks about how the drug war is really overtly racist, but it's not so much a new Jim Crow. This has always been part of Jim Crow, always been part of the suppression of minority communities. It hasn't been an extension of the drug war. The number one drug seized on the border is marijuana. Like 99% of the weight, of the drugs by weight seized on the border are marijuana. That is if it was not for that, that is the huge justification for the militarization of the border.
And do you happen to know how many people are in jail because of marijuana?
I don't know I don't have the statistics on me, so I don't want to misquote it. It tends to be, there's I'm trying to think. It's I think in the 10,000 range, but a big thing about marijuana is a lot of people are in for marijuana not because that was what they're convicted of, but that's how they violated their parole.
Okay.
So, you're convicted of something else, you're out on parole, you're caught with some marijuana, you're back in prison. So those people wouldn't be counted as in prison for marijuana, but that's why they're behind bars still. Or
say if you're young and you're juvenile and you're caught with it, that gets you into the system.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you said, I was reading that this year, in the last couple of years, there's been a really big switch in terms of attitudes towards legalization.
Yeah, so we've seen a huge turnaround. If you go back just 12 years ago, I think only about a third of the country supported marijuana legalization. And it has been growing steadily since then. And just recently, especially after the 2012 elections where Colorado and Washington State legalized marijuana, we've had a huge surge in increase. Gallup, it's now 58%. Other polls have it in the mid 50s. So we went from basically no one supporting marijuana legalization maybe 12 years ago to it being the clear majority opinion, across all the polling now.
That is fantastic. So a lot of people are really upset over what's happening with the criminalization of drugs and how it's being used to target poor communities and communities of color. So you're being able to, this idea that people are stuck being miserable about that, but you can show a vision that, hey, we've seen with alcohol what happened in terms of how alcohol went from being prohibited to then being legalized, and that what's lacking right now in talking about the drug war and the process from not just decriminalization but full-out legalization, that there's actually a point where we're going to be after legalization and actually implementing and regulating, and it's going to be this patchwork of areas. So I just wanted, if you wanted to start talking about that in terms of right now. So we have Colorado and Washington plus the various overlays of the medical marijuana.
Yeah.
So what are we seeing right now in the current case studies that we're seeing with the legalization?
Yeah, so, I wrote the book for two reasons. One, if you give people a vision of what legalized marijuana is going to be like, they tend to be more supportive. Polling for, do you think marijuana should be legal, tends to not pull as highly as, do you think marijuana should be taxed and regulated like alcohol? And so I wanted to, one, make it less scary, and two, give people a sense of all the sort of myriad of issues that will emerge that we'll have to deal with and all the policy questions we'll have to get to. When it comes to the current patchwork, it's ironic when Prohibition ended before the 21st Amendment was passed. Several states had ballot initiatives saying they would not enforce Prohibition any longer. They were basically going to opt out, and two of them were Colorado and Washington State. About a year and a half before the 21st Amendment was eventually ratified. So there's sort of history repeating itself right there. So as we currently stand, we've got two states where it's legal, Colorado and Washington. Colorado should open its first retail shops starting at the beginning of next year, Washington a little bit later in the year. And then there are currently, I believe 18 medical marijuana states with the ease of getting medical marijuana varying greatly. California, basically anyone can show up, say they've got a problem, get a prescription. A place like Washington, D.C., where we're in, it's very difficult. I think there's only about 30 or so patients who've qualified. You have to have, one of a tiny limited number of conditions, Got to have sort of multiple verifications that you have that condition. So, already there's a huge sort of variation that we're seeing.
Great. How are states, one concept that you talked about, so I did some work in Kentucky, and if you went, there were some counties, in Bourbon County, where bourbon was actually invented, it's a wet it's a wet county, but in some areas there you have dry counties that have wet cities.
Yeah.
So do you see this happening with marijuana legalization?
Yeah, we're actually already seeing it in Colorado. They have, it's called local options. It's very popular after Prohibition ended. The entire ending of Prohibition was very localized. So the 21st Amendment gave states the option, like they were given the power to decide whether alcohol would be legal. And then a lot of those states then gave their counties the power to decide.
You were saying, so this time 50 years ago in Mississippi, you couldn't have alcohol.
Yeah, Prohibition did not end in Mississippi until 1966, and in many of the counties, it's still going on.
Wow.
You can't brew beer at home in about half the state. Like, that's still illegal under Mississippi law. And, we're seeing this pattern repeat. In Colorado, they have a local option in their law. So individual cities can say, we're not going to have marijuana shops. We're not going to allow them. We're going to prohibit them. And I think that, I think it was very popular with alcohol. I think we're going to see it repeated. I know, just like a sort of funny aside, the county the Jack Daniels is brewed in is still dry county. So you can't buy Jack Daniels in the county where Jack Daniels is produced.
Wow. So there's like the bourbon trail, but it's like no sipping. No
Yeah, they recently in 2012 just got a law passed where you could have 3 small samples of Jack Daniels at the distillery.
Wow. But then you go to Louisiana.
Yeah.
Where, I don't know if you guys have been to Louisiana, you have drive-through daiquiris, and it's considered, as long as you don't have the top of the straw off, you're fine in your car.
Yeah, it's an open container. There's physically not a barrier between the liquid in the air. It's these are the weird sort of technicalities you often have to deal with once something's no longer prohibited. It's like a legal product, and you gotta make these decisions.
And so just kind of a pause on the Kickstarter, why did you choose to do a Kickstarter to get funding? Are publishers not beating down the door to fund writing about looking at what's going to be life like after drugs are legalized?
Yeah, there's 2 reasons. One, we weren't getting that much interest from publishers. And 2, the turnaround time was so long. I finished the writing, but even... I'm getting it finally, copy edited and everything and formatted. But even up to the last minute, there's new developments that I'm adding stuff into. The book will be as up to date as possible. New revenue, just Uruguay, just this week, legalized marijuana.
Awesome.
Becoming the first country to do that. They've got a very tightly regulated model, but so I was putting information in right up to the end, and with traditional publishing, the books. Basically a year out of date by the time it physically shows up in stores.
Right. And I could see it being hard because a lot of people, both corporate type media and publishers and even some of our progressive politicians are still afraid. I think we, in a lot of ways, talking about the legalization. I mean, legalization of drugs is a scary topic. I used to live in Ward 7, D.C., where we have a huge drug problem and crime and a lot of problems where legalization would be amazing, but our city council person, Yvette Alexander, was terrified of even the word decriminalization.
Yeah.
I'm like, hello, this is going to help our community. It's going to keep people out of jail. It's going to have people pathways to having good lives and stop a lot of the racial profiling that happens. And she's like, no, decriminalization is bad. So what are you seeing in terms of people's who have powers, risk averseness to wanting to deal with this serious topic?
Well, and unfortunately, there's a big divide between politicians and the people. Gallup showed 58% of the country supports legalizing marijuana now. I believe the bill, which would let states decide in Congress, has I think 17 or 18 co-sponsors, so it's about 4% of Congress. 53% of the country, 4% of Congress shows you that there's a big divide. The one sort of bright side is there's been a slow, steady increase in just a few prominent Democrats coming out for it. I know over in Maryland, one of the candidates for governor, Heather Mazur, came out for it recently, just last month. There is a representative in New York that just put up forward a bill. In California, the lieutenant governor is going to push for it in 2016. If Brown didn't run, he would probably run. So there's a handful of Democrats that are finally realizing, hey, like, this is what the people want. Like, I think it took that vote in Colorado and Washington, like, oh, these are what people are voting for, because it did better than Obama in Colorado, marijuana.
Wow. And every election year, whether it's midterm or general, the group that everybody is wrangling for the youth vote.
Yeah.
Because the theory is that if you get somebody voting when they're 18 or they're 22, and they get habitualized to voting, they'll be voters, and people for the most part tend to stick with the party that they're affiliated with when they're younger, and so that's why there's tons of money that is spent. So if politicians are really wanting the youth vote, what side should they be on this issue?
Well, young people usually, 70% support marijuana legalization. They're strongly in support of it. I actually did some looking at the exit polls from 2012, and there appeared to be a real increase in the youth turnout in the states where marijuana was on the ballot, Colorado and Washington, compared to other states. So like this, this is an issue young people care about. It's funny, every time Obama tried to do one of those sort of online things, like his YouTube town hall or his Ask Questions or his positions, it was always marijuana, was always the top thing. His YouTube town hall is like 198 of the 200 top questions were all, marijuana or drug policy reform. Because that's where our generation is at. We grew up experiencing all the ills of the drug war. We know it'll never win it. It'll never produce some kind of victory banner.
Right. Because I think I'm a few years older than you, but I mean I grew up I was a child during the 80s, and you had the Hugs Not Drugs, and you had the whole starting the onslaught of just nonstop media about drugs being horrible, people who use them being horrible. Of course, as we know, when we say horrible, poor people go to jail and rich people go to therapy.
Yeah.
And they go to drug rehab centers. It's never, there are two ways of how people are triaged when they have the drugs.
Yeah, it's funny they keep talking about reform, making it considering a medical problem, not an enforcement problem. We still spend way more on locking people up in prison, and raiding their houses than we do spend on actual treatment.
What's more effective?
Yeah, you look at other, the great irony of it is despite having some of the most aggressive anti-marijuana laws, we have the highest use rates in the world. Amsterdam and the Netherlands have lower marijuana use rates than the United States does. We spend billions, raiding people's houses and, destroying marijuana crops and arresting people.
Wow. And are there corporate backers to this whole drug war?
Oh, yeah. The prison industrial complex, there's a lot of private prison companies that make a lot of money. There's a whole sort of testing industry, when it comes to drug testing. The only drug you can really test for is marijuana. Most other drugs are wash out of your system in a day or two. But, so they do drug testing at schools, at most jobs, most federal contractors. That's a huge industry that's making a lot of money off of this. The whole supplying of just, the police, military style equipment to the police, for the SWAT style raids. There's a lot of people who have money in it, especially local law enforcement, because of the way drug forfeit laws are written. They get to keep that. So, let's say a car had a pound of marijuana in the back. They get to keep that car. The local sheriff or whatever. They can sell that. That money goes to the sheriff department. And there's a whole sort of scandal.
That's my friend in Philadelphia has done a whole series on how much illegal property, how much police have taken illegally from people through forfeiture, including there was a woman who was letting her son, who had just gotten out of jail, stay at her house.
Yeah.
And then he was caught with drugs, and they seized her house, even though he wasn't an owner.
Well, in the way the laws are written is you don't have to be convicted. They could basically...
Wait. I'm sorry. You don't have to be convicted?
No, for them to take the property, you don't need to be convicted. The property has committed the crime.
So somebody who didn't like you could have planted this drugs in your car to get you in trouble, and you're just...
Even if you can somehow prevent yourself from actually being convicted, they can still seize the assets. This is a real problem where you have police and sheriff departments basically extorting money. There's a famous case not so long ago where the guy he had like a big suitcase full of money. For whatever reason, he was in like the diamond trade or something, so did a lot of cash transactions. They're like, we suspect this money is illegal drugs, and they just seized it. And like they didn't even charge him with anything. They just sort of tried to keep the money. And then what they were like, he's like, I want the money back. And they're like, well, go get a lawyer. Well, like the lawyer is going to cost almost as much as the money, and so they basically try to cut a deal with you, to only give you half your money back or something. It's a horribly corrupt system. I don't write about that too much in the book, but that is a huge problem.
So
that doesn't
why
get
don't
much
you?
coverage.
We need folks to kickstart it. So how much are you looking at to get to completion right now?
So we're trying to raise a total of $5,000. We're up to like 4,500. So another about $600 to go.
And if somebody wanted to get lunch with you?
Yeah, so there's a series of prizes. Like $10 will get you like the ebook. Like $15 will get you the paperback. We got a T-shirt if you give a little more, designed by somebody. For $600, you can come to DC. I'll have lunch with you. I'll debate these issues with you. For $1,000, if you're an organization, I'll go like speak at your event.
Right. So if anybody who's watching is a student, this would be a great way to go to your student affairs today and be like, we want to have this great topic, because I have a feeling that if you brought John to your campus, you'd get a packed auditorium.
I would hope so.
People are into that. Just why don't you walk us through your book? So we have about 10 minutes left of the special report, so just walk us through like the arc of the story and the narrative that you lay out.
All right, so the book, I basically wrote it from the perspective of like 2030, because I think if you look at the polling numbers and the way the law is moving, we've got initiative campaigns probably in Oregon and Alaska, 2014. 2016, there's probably going to be about 6 states. And so I think by like 2020, 2022, we'll probably have some federal law passed legalizing it. So I look at it just like a few years after when the federal law, or when I think federal law will change. And I walk people through basically all aspects of it. So, I say like, hey, like if you're looking for the stores, these are where the stores would be. Then I explain, this is how local option laws works. This is how it's gone through alcohol. Then I sort of describe what would be in the stores, like how the industry would likely shape up, and explain like how there's a lot of concentration in the beer market, but that's because of bad regulations. They had rules that prevented you from selling directly to customers. You couldn't have a brew pub until the 80s in this country. And so that really crushed the local...
Is that why microbrewing is just now becoming this cool, hip thing?
Yeah, it really exploded because of the law change. You couldn't homebrew until like 78. So like you didn't have people experimenting at home. And in most of the country, you couldn't have what were called tied houses, where like a brewery would sell directly to customers through a bar or a pub or something, until the 80s. And once they changed the law, we've seen a real explosion in microbrews. Before there's...
And that's good for the economy.
Yeah. Before there's only like 80 big breweries. Now there's, over 3,000 breweries. Wow. But like, in places like Germany where they never had these really silly restrictions, they've always had like a large, diverse marketplace. So I kind of explain that, and then, I take people through everything. So like if you bought marijuana, where would you be able to smoke it? Looking at, anti-cigarette smoking laws, open container laws, give you an idea of where you'd be able to smoke it. Walk through what the price would probably change,
so like
how taxes would work.
South Beach in Miami, you have this whole area where you can walk from bar to bar with your open container. So you could see something similar in South Beach, probably having an open area where you could walk from bar to bar. Yeah,
there's only a limited number of places where you can walk with open containers in the country, like Vegas Strip, like the French Quarter. I suspect you'll probably have a few of those like this. I like came up with the idea of like there would be like an Oaksterdam district. Like they've really been known for marijuana. I suspect they'll probably try to develop some marijuana tourism industry. I imagine a few other parts of the country will. And then I imagine just like with alcohol, most everywhere, most of your, suburban areas, you won't be able to have marijuana in public. Like the way people see marijuana is they think it should be legal. They think prohibition has failed. They want it to be controlled and restricted. You should be able to smoke marijuana. Sort of don't do it in my face.
Right.
And I think that's how the rules are going to shape up.
And then the rest of your book?
Yeah, and then I like go through explaining how I think we'll get there. Like how is the cultural change taking place? Probably the legislative change. I talk about the impact it'll have probably on public health and medical marijuana.
Wait, in terms of public health, I remember being scared. Like, people heard it's a gateway drug. You'll lose your memory. You'll gain a lot of weight. Just like, especially like in that middle school age where like you're being in your like anti-drug classes and you're just being beaten into how bad marijuana is for you. Is there truth to that?
Marijuana is remarkably safe. Like, it's impossible to overdose on marijuana. You know, there are a few health things. You know, obviously marijuana intoxication, you know, reduces your sort of short-term memory. I wouldn't try studying while high. You know, it raises your heart rate. So if you're like old and have heart problems, you probably shouldn't be smoking marijuana. Beyond that, you know, its medical problems are very small, especially compared to alcohol or most prescription drugs, which kill, you know, over 20,000 people a year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, marijuana kills nobody. You know, I wouldn't go so far as to say marijuana is entirely safe, but it is dramatically safer than basically everything else out there. And the idea of a gateway drug has sort of in total nonsense. The only way marijuana has really been a gateway drug is because prohibitions made it a gateway drug. Because if you're going to buy marijuana, you have to go to criminals who are often selling other drugs. So there's a study in Amsterdam. People who buy marijuana in Amsterdam are rarely offered other drugs by the places that buy marijuana. Compared to the rest of Europe, where you have to go to criminals to buy your marijuana, the chance of you being offered harder drugs goes up dramatically. And so it's only by like injecting you into the criminal underground.
So it's like it's basically marketing.
Yeah.
So it's the marketing of the other drugs that is it gets people to try harder drugs.
Well, you know, it's like they don't care. Like they're criminals. They're already breaking the law. Like it doesn't matter if they're selling marijuana or selling marijuana and heroin, as opposed to, you know, a liquor store. You know, they're also selling heroin. Like they get in a lot of trouble. And once marijuana is legalized, you know, you won't see a marijuana shop selling anything besides marijuana.
And then how do you sum up your book? Like, what is your big, grand conclusion of this whole project, of the idea of being able to see the country after legalization?
Well, I really want people to think about just how wide open our choices are. You know, French fries are legal. You know, tanks can technically be bought by people under really limited conditions.
Whoa, I don't know if I want tanks.
So, but I'm saying, like you got to go through a lot of work if you want to buy a tank. But, like, there's you know, when you say something's legal, the whole spectrum of what it could be like is huge. You know, you can make it so readily available, you can get it at any fast food restaurant, or you could treat it like they treat hard alcohol in North Carolina, where you can only buy it in state-run stores. Mm-hmm. So the government has a complete monopoly. It's a controlled state. The only places you can buy hard alcohol, like for sale, is at ABC stores run by the government, you know, where they have a tight control on it and it's heavily taxed. So, you know, there's this whole sort of spectrum, and we got to make these decisions, because if you don't make the right decisions now, you're kind of stuck with it. Mm-hmm. You know, political inertia is like the most powerful force in politics. My favorite example is look at the Electoral College. It's really stupid. It's really unfair. Look at the polling. Nobody likes
George
it.
Bush.
Yet, 200 years later, we're still stuck with it. Like, that's how powerful inertia is. Even something really stupid, once it's put in place, is tough to get rid of. So, you know, you really want to think of these things at the beginning to try to get them right, you know, the first go-around.
Wow, this has been great. Make sure everybody who's watching goes to Kickstarter. I think everybody who's watching or listening should definitely chip in. At least, is it $10 to get the ebook?
$9 to get the ebook.
Not even $10, less than $10. So if we can get 50 of y'all to chip in for an ebook, we're able to push it over and have this kickstarted. So I just want to, if you have any final words in terms of, actually, I want to bring this up really quick. What's your favorite moment of the drug war you had mentioned earlier? Yeah,
one thing I like is for years the government would brag about how they are destroying lots of marijuana plants. You know, they were spending, you know, some $200 million or whatever destroying marijuana plants. Almost all the marijuana plants they were destroying were feral hemp. You know, this was hemp that was like, you know, grown by farmers during World War II or before. Can't get high off of it. So they'd brag that they'd destroy all this marijuana. It was all useless marijuana, like 90%, you know, 99% of it. And ironically, they were making it easier to grow illegal marijuana, because by preventing hemp from being around, like cross-pollinating and ruining the marijuana you're trying to grow. So I feel like it's a perfect metaphor for the drug war. Lots of money wasted, nothing accomplished, perhaps counterproductive.
Wow. And on that note, This guy's really funny, so if you have a little bit more money to spend, you might want to spring for lunch. In the meantime, if people want to keep track of your writings, where should they go on a daily basis to read you?
All right, so I write for Firedog Lake.
And what's Firedog Lake?
Firedog Lake is one of the largest progressive websites. I write about drug policy, also healthcare policy, and several political issues. And so on drug policy, I write about that on the Just Say Now campaign, which is a subset of FDL. So if you go there, you can see my writing.
Great. So everybody should make sure that you're going to firedoglake.com to read John Walker's writings on drug policy at Just Say Now.
Yeah.
Great play on Just Say No and on healthcare policy. And keep tuning in to We Act Radio, 1480 AM here in DC, and online on our YouTube page, and check out our other shows. Thank you all for watching and listening, and make sure you kickstart after legalization today. Thank you.
Thank you.